Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about genetics and sort of going over an introduction to um, the genetic basis of inheritance. So what we mean by that is we're getting at the question of how traits are passed from parents to offspring. And people have known for a really long time that there's something that is passed when two parents have a child. There's something that's passed on to that child, right? Children look at least something like their parents. And aside from looks, you might also think about some things like temperament or other sort of personality traits that children might have in common with parents. And this is really obvious when you look at siblings, right? So siblings they tend to be, at least in some ways, similar to one another. Generally, you would think of your sibling as being more similar to you than some random stranger, right? And this is most obvious when you look at identical twins, which are sort of genetically, at least, the most similar that two people can be because their DNA is identical. Um, and it's also true for non-identical twins and siblings that aren't twins at all, right? So these are you could think about Venus and Serena Williams. These are the Dos Santos brothers in soccer, the Watt brothers in football. This is Rondé and Tiki Barber, also from football. So in these examples, that these siblings are even more similar because they all went into sports as their profession. But even just thinking about siblings, or maybe if you have a sibling, thinking about the similarities that you might share with that sibling. So we know that for genetic siblings, there are similarities that they'll share with one another. And presumably these similarities that siblings have are in some way inherited from the parents that both siblings share, right? So in this video, we'll be talking about how that happens. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the contributions of a man named Gregor Mendel to inheritance and to the field of inheritance and genetics. But before he sort of came onto the scene, the big idea for how parents pass their traits onto offspring was this blending hypothesis. And the idea with this blending hypothesis is that when parents create an offspring, their traits are sort of smushed together into in the same way that you could mix two colors of paint. And so in the offspring, that the two traits of or all of the traits of the different parents are gone. They've been combined together, and there's no more individual traits from either of the parents that are present in the offspring. So this offspring, if it was to have offspring of its own, we would never again get yellow or blue popping up because those characteristics are just lost. They've been combined, they've formed the green, and now the green is the only thing that the offspring has. So this was the more prevalent idea earlier on in the field of inheritance, and then we'll come to see how now we have this idea of what's called particulate hypothesis of inheritance. And this is the idea that when parents are having offspring, there are discrete heritable units, which we know as alleles, and they don't mix together, but they instead remain separate. So this is showing this idea here, where we're still mixing together yellow and blue. And so when we get sort of a green offspring, you can see that the green is really still composed of individual pieces that have blue and yellow that are sort of remaining individually. And so if we cross together two of these green offspring, you could imagine that this yellow could still separate out and we could still get the yellow. The blue could still separate out, so we could still get blue. And then obviously we could keep it green as well. So we get specific individual pieces from the parents that are maintained in the offspring, even though they're sort of combined together. They're not physically combined. Okay, so how did this particulate hypothesis come about? It's all started with this guy, like I said, his name was Gregor Mendel. He was a monk from Austria, and he figured out sort of more mathematically some basic patterns for inheritance and heredity. So, like I said, people already knew that offspring look like their parents, that siblings or genetic siblings are going to look like one another, but he sort of figured out more more specifics about how all this works. And to do this, he was looking at pea plants. So he was into gardening and was working with pea plants to figure all this out. And specifically, he was tracing these 7 different traits that pea plants can have. So, for example, he was looking at flower color, which flowers can be either purple or white. He was looking at flower position. So you can have flowers that are sort of more on the side of the plant, which we call axial, versus on the top of the plant, which we would say terminal. And so for each of these traits that he was looking at, there were sort of 2 different versions that that trait could come in, 2 different variations of the trait. So for flower color, it was either that they're purple or white. There was no pink flowers, there was no light purple flowers. It was just one or the other, binary. And for seed color, they could either be yellow or green, or round or wrinkled. So all of these traits that he was looking at, there were only 2 different variations that you could see in these traits. And we'll be focusing in on flower color to sort of trace through these different ideas that he came up with. So what he saw when he was looking at these traits in pea plants was a curious pattern that would start to emerge. So he would have parent plants, and we call the parent generation the P generation, and the P just stands for parents, even though it was also in pea plants, but the P stands for parents. And he used what were called true breeding parents. And true breeding just means that if you let a plant self-fertilize, it's only going to give rise to other plants that look like it. So a true breeding purple plant would only give rise to offspring that were also purple. So purple true breeding would only give rise to purple flowers, and a true breeding white plant would only give rise to white flowers. So if you let these guys self-fertilize, they'll only produce same colored offspring plants. So what he saw when he crossed a true breeding purple flower plant with a true breeding white flower plant was that in the first generation, and we call each generation is going to be F. The F stands for filial, if that helps you remember, but F1 is the first generation, so the child or the children of these parents, was he saw that all of the plants had purple flowers. But when he let these purple F1 first generation plants, when he let these self-fertilize, he saw that in the second generation, so you could think of these as being sort of like the grandchildren of that original parent generation, he saw that in the F2 generation, a quarter of the plants had white flowers. So this white characteristic, this white trait popped back out, even though none of the F1 generation were white. And the other remaining 3/4 of the plants were purple. So he saw this same pattern where in the second generation of children, one of the parent characteristics would pop back out in this 1/4 or 25% ratio. And he wanted to know how that is. So he didn't have the sort of modern terminology that we're going to be using, but since we do have modern terminology, we're going to just go ahead and use it. So what Mendel was studying, although he didn't use the word, was he was studying alleles. And remember that alleles are going to be different variations or different forms of the same gene. So the example that we used in the previous video, and this is a simplified example, but it serves it gets the job done, is hair color. So you could think of, for one hair color gene, you could have a red hair allele, a black hair allele, a brown hair allele, a blonde hair allele, etc. And so for this flower color, we're going to have 2 different alleles, a purple flower allele and a white flower allele. So it's both the same flower color gene, it's both the same flower color gene, but you can have 2 different forms, purple and white. And generally, we are going to use letters to signify or to be sort of shorthand for these different alleles. So this big capital P is going to represent the purple flower allele, and this little p is going to represent, or lowercase p is going to represent the white color allele. And we also know that for humans, at least, each person is going to carry 2 alleles for each gene. And those 2 alleles are coming from the 2 genetic parents, right? So one from your genetic mom and one from your genetic dad. And so for each pair of homologous chromosomes, you're going to have the same gene on both of those chromosomes, and each gene is going to be one allele. So you're going to have a total of 2 alleles for each gene, one from genetic mom and one from genetic dad. So each person is carrying 2 alleles. And because of this, you could think of sort of 2 possible situations. One would be that for your 2 alleles that you're carrying, that both alleles that you have are the same. So you could imagine for a plant, maybe it has 2 purple flower alleles. So big P, we said that the big P is purple, so it could have 2 purple alleles. Or if we said that the little p is for white flowers, maybe it has 2 white flower alleles. And the other way the other sort of situation that could happen is that you could have 2 different alleles. So one purple flower allele and one white flower allele. And the word that we use, or the words that we use for these 2 different cases, are homozygous and heterozygous. So homozygous is when you have 2 alleles that are the same. So 2 white flower alleles, 2 purple flower alleles, 2 alleles for brown hair, 2 alleles for green eyes, etc., etc. And heterozygous is when you have 2 different alleles. And so this would be one allele for purple, one allele for white, or maybe one allele for black hair and one allele for red hair. And so, when we're thinking about how these alleles are going to manifest themselves in an organism, it's really more interesting to think about a heterozygous organism, because if you have a homozygous situation for your alleles, then it's obvious what you're going to look like, right? So if you have 2 purple alleles, you're going to be a purple flower. If you have 2 white alleles, then you'll be a white flower. But what if you have one purple flower allele and a white flower allele? What will you look like then? At least for simple Mendelian genetics, the answer to this is going to depend on which allele is dominant and which one is recessive. And so one allele is dominant if it's able to override or sort of mask the other allele. So if you have at least one of this dominant allele, it'll make itself shown, it'll make itself visible. And so the trait that you'll have will be the one that matches what the dominant allele corresponds to. And then the other option is that the other allele is going to be recessive. And so recessive alleles don't show themselves if they're in the presence of a dominant allele. So they can be sort of hidden by a dominant allele. And so for a recessive allele, you'll need 2 copies of that recessive allele in order to see the trait that corresponds to it. So what we're looking at here is we can see that the dominant color is going to be purple, or we could say that the purple flower allele is the dominant one. And so when we see a purple flower, it could either be homozygous for the dominant trait, so capital P, or this plant could also be heterozygous with one purple allele and one white color allele. But because the purple one is dominant, it's the plant itself is going to be a purple color. And then to see a white flower, you need to have 2 of the recessive alleles. So this little p, remember, is corresponding to the white flower allele. And so in order to see white flowers, we need to have 2 of that recessive allele. And just by convention, we typically use a capital letter for the dominant allele and a lowercase letter for the recessive allele. So capital P for the dominant purple, lowercase p for the recessive white. Okay. And then the last hypothesis that we're getting from Mendel, and hopefully this makes intuitive sense to you since we've already talked about meiosis, but we're just going to give it a name now. So it's this principle of segregation. And this principle of segregation says that when we're making gametes, so when we're making sperm and eggs, the 2 alleles from each gene have to separate from one another into different gametes. So what this is saying is that each gamete is only going to carry one allele for any given gene. And so if you're thinking about an organism that's homozygous dominant, so if it's big P, then all of the gametes that that organism makes are going to be carrying one big P allele. And Correspondingly, if an organism is homozygous for the recessive allele, so little p, then all of the gametes that that organism makes are just going to carry one copy of the little p allele. But if an organism is heterozygous, so one big P and one little p, then each gamete is only going to carry one of those alleles, either a big P or a little p. And it'll be split 50% between which ones get the big P and which ones get the little p. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this video here, and in the next video that goes with this one, we'll talk about using what are called Punnett squares to predict what will be the offspring, or what kind of offspring we'll get from different kinds of crosses. So I'll see you guys soon.